The king's daughter exposed with his minister. What followed shook the entire kingdom. It began with a discovery whispered in shadows, a revelation so explosive that it tore through the silence of the royal palace like a blade. Behind golden doors and towering walls, the unthinkable had been uncovered. The young princess, the king's pride, the symbol of purity for an entire empire, had been found in the forbidden company of the one man the king trusted above all others. But this was no ordinary scandal. It was not simply betrayal of a father's trust or the humiliation of a court that thrived on order and honor. It was something deeper, darker, and far more dangerous. For the minister was not born of noble blood. His skin bore the shade of a people long despised, long chained by the weight of prejudice. He had risen through brilliance and ambition, but the kingdom had never truly accepted him. Now, caught in the embrace of royalty, he had shattered the illusion of purity the throne depended upon. The king's rage was not just for betrayal. It was for contamination, for the fear that his daughter's choice would stain his bloodline and weaken his crown. What followed was not a trial, nor reason, nor mercy. It was an eruption of vengeance cloaked in righteousness, an act of cruelty that would echo through history as both punishment and warning. An empire that prided itself on justice revealed its darkest face. Its true foundation, built not on law, but on prejudice, power, and fear. This is not merely the tale of a forbidden love. It is the unraveling of a kingdom, a story of how racism and power can twist truth into weapon and turn love into the spark that ignites a storm. And before it ends, you will be left asking, how far can a ruler go to protect his throne, when the enemy he fears is not war, but the blood that runs through his own daughter's veins? The kingdom stood like a monument to power, its walls gleaming, under the sun by day and swallowing the moonlight by night. From afar it looked eternal, unbreakable stone, towers scraping the sky, banners rippling with the insignia of a dynasty that claimed divinity. Yet, within those walls, a darker truth festered. The air was thick, not with reverence, but with silence. The silence of people who had learned that their words could cost them their lives. The king ruled with an iron grip, his word law, his anger feared, his judgments final. But beneath his grandeur lay a system more sinister than any sword. A hierarchy carved not only by blood and rank, but by race, skin, and heritage. Those born into privilege walked freely across marble halls, while those marked by difference carried chains, invisible or real, wherever they went. To the king, such divisions were the natural order of the world. To question them was to invite ruin. The city beyond the palace mirrored this cruel order. Golden spires glittered in the heart of the capital, but the further one walked, the more the streets darkened. At the edges, where the outcasts lived, the homes sagged like broken bones. The faces bore scars of hunger and humiliation, and every breath was steeped in resentment. The people moved in silence, their backs bent, not only by labor, but by centuries of disdain. Inside the palace, the same poison ruled, though masked by polished stone and perfumed chambers. Servants of the wrong blood were shadows in the corridors, seen but never acknowledged, their lives reduced to obedience. They were forced to bow until their necks ached, to hide their eyes, to erase their existence unless summoned. And, yet even in silence, they saw everything. They witnessed the hypocrisies of power, the sins of nobility, the contradictions of a kingdom that preached honor while practicing cruelty. The king's council chamber was the very heart of this order, carved oak, glittering torches, and a throne raised high above the rest. As if to remind all that the ruler was no mere man, his ministers knelt at his feet, each one desperate to remain in favor. They whispered about loyalty, but their loyalty was bound not to justice or truth, but to survival. The king's shadow stretched over all of them, and within that shadow, secrets multiplied like roots in dark soil. The people knew little of what occurred behind those gilded doors, but they knew enough to fear it. Rumors seeped through the cracks, that nobles conspired, that servants disappeared, that anyone who dared defy the unspoken rules of race and power met an end too brutal to describe. These whispers fed the city's dread, creating a silence heavier than any decree. The kingdom to outsiders seemed orderly and eternal, but to those who lived beneath its crushing weight, it was a cage disguised as paradise. And cages, no matter how strong, always tremble before the storm. For in this kingdom, where shadows ruled and silence was survival, the seeds of scandal had already been planted, seeds that would one day shatter the walls of power and drown the throne in shame. In the heart of the palace, behind walls thick enough to muffle screams, lived those whose lives would intertwine in tragedy. Each carried their own burden, though not all were equal. Some bore crowns of gold, while others bore scars unseen. The king, sovereign and tyrant, was a man consumed by the illusion of control. His word bent nations, but his heart was a fortress of pride and fear. He feared disorder, feared betrayal, feared the stain of dishonor that might tarnish his dynasty. And so, he ruled not with love, but with suspicion, watching every glance, weighing every whisper, seeking in shadows the enemies that perhaps existed only in his mind. His obsession with purity, of blood, of race, of legacy, was the iron pillar upon which his kingdom rested. Yet this pillar was already cracking, though he could not yet see it. The minister, his most trusted advisor, stood always at his side. To the court, he was the image of loyalty, a man of wisdom, diligence, and unwavering devotion to his king. But loyalty, in kingdoms such as this, was never pure. It was survival. The minister had risen higher than most men of his heritage were ever allowed, tolerated only because his service was indispensable. He wore his honor like armor, yet within him lived a restless fire, a longing to be seen not as lesser, not as tolerated, but as equal, a longing the king could never grant. And then there was the daughter. Born into privilege, wrapped in silks and guarded by walls, she had never felt hunger, never tasted fear as her people did. But innocence is not freedom. Her life was a prison of a different kind, her every step dictated by the weight of her father's expectations. She was a symbol, not a person, a vessel for alliances, a jewel meant to shine only where the king decreed. Yet beneath the still surface of her quiet obedience, something stirred. She had watched the minister in silence, studied the subtle dignity with which he endured slights others would not survive. And in that silence, an unspoken bond began to grow, a dangerous bond. Around them moved the servants and shadows, the ones history never names. They scrubbed the marble floors, lit the torches, and bowed until their spines curved like broken branches. Their lives were measured not in years, but in orders followed and lashes endured. Yet they saw, they always saw, in their silence lived the kingdom's truest memory, the cruelties of the king, the ambitions of his council, the hidden glances between the daughter and the minister. They carried these secrets like ghosts, powerless to speak them, yet cursed to remember. Each life was bound by chains, some of gold, some of iron, but chains all the same. The king's pride, the minister's silence, the daughter's yearning, the servant's invisibility. In these chains lay the seeds of their undoing. For in a palace where silence was survival, even the faintest spark of forbidden desire could become a fire great enough to consume them all. It began not with thunder, but with whispers. In the vast corridors of the palace, where torches flickered, against walls of stone, moments existed that no decree could erase. A glance too long, a silence too heavy, an exchange that lingered in the air longer than it should have. To the eyes of the king's court, such things were invisible, but to the shadows that watched, they were sparks falling upon dry wood. The daughter, bound by duty, often walked the gardens at dusk. They were her only refuge, the only space where the weight of expectation loosened. There, the air smelled of roses and earth, not of politics and fear. And it was there, beneath carved arches and hidden alcoves, that her path would sometimes cross with the ministers. By chance, some said. By destiny, others whispered. At first, there was nothing more than courtesy. A bow, a respectful word, an exchange as brief as a passing breeze. But the silence after those moments carried weight. The daughter, accustomed to shallow flattery, saw in the minister something she had never known: restraint, dignity, and a strength born not of privilege but of survival. And he, who had endured a lifetime of humiliation in silence, saw in her eyes not scorn but recognition. Recognition was dangerous. The palace was a place where eyes never slept. Servants who bent to polish floors still noticed glances. Guards who stood motionless at doors still heard footsteps that lingered too long. And though no word had been spoken between the daughter and the minister that could betray them, the air itself began to shift. A seed had been planted, silent, unseen, but alive. It grew in the smallest of ways. A stolen moment in a hallway, where their hands brushed against each other and lingered for the briefest breath. A night in the council chamber, where her gaze lingered as the minister spoke, her expression betraying an admiration too dangerous to reveal. These were moments that should have been nothing, but in a kingdom built on fear and prejudice, they became everything. The servants noticed first. They whispered not in words, but in glances, in hushed breaths exchanged in kitchens and stables. They had seen such stories before, and they knew how they ended. For in this palace, nothing remained hidden forever. Secrets were prey, and sooner or later, the predators would come. The daughter knew the risk. The minister knew it even more. For him, the danger was not scandal, but death. A single rumor could erase everything he had built, everything he had endured. Yet silence became unbearable. To walk the halls and pretend there was nothing between them was a torment deeper than chains. And so, he did nothing. And in doing nothing, he let the fire grow. The kingdom still slept, unaware of the storm that was gathering in silence. But storms are never truly silent. They whisper before they roar. And soon, the whispers of the palace would turn into a cry that even the king could not ignore. At first, the silence was harmless. A glance in the gardens, a hesitation in the corridor, a smile quickly buried beneath the weight of watchful eyes. But palaces are places where silence is never truly silent. Every pause, every shadow, every flicker of hesitation becomes a story waiting to be told. And in this kingdom, stories were more dangerous than swords. The servants noticed first. They always did. Moving like ghosts through the corridors, they carried trays and messages, swept floors and lit candles. Their lives were overlooked, their faces unseen. But their eyes saw everything. They saw the daughter's footsteps linger in the halls where the minister often walked. They saw the slight tremor in her breath when his presence filled a chamber. They saw the way his head bowed lower when her gaze found him across a crowded court. And though nothing was said aloud, the air between them told a story the walls could not contain. From the servants' whispers, the rumors spread like smoke. First to the guards who stood endless watch at doors, then to attendants who lingered too long outside council chambers. A name paired with another name, spoken in hushed tones, then denied as if never spoken at all. The minister, the daughter, together. A thought unthinkable, yet irresistible. Nobles, too, began to notice. In banquets, where goblets overflowed with wine and laughter filled the marble halls, their sharp eyes cut through the crowd. They noted the daughter's distraction, the minister's silence. They noted what should not be noted, and what could never be spoken openly. For them, suspicion was not merely curiosity, it was opportunity. The downfall of one man could be the rise of another, and so they let the whispers slip from their tongues like venom, waiting for the poison to take hold. The king, at first, dismissed the unease he felt. Rulers of empires always live surrounded. by shadows, and paranoia was as constant as breath. Yet something stirred beneath his certainty. He noticed when the daughter's eyes wandered. He noticed when the minister paused, as though words stuck in his throat. He noticed when silence grew heavier between them than any words could. A father sees what a ruler tries to deny, and the king was both. Still, nothing could yet be named. No evidence, no crime. Only whispers that clung to walls, heavier each day, pressing closer, suffocating those who dared not acknowledge them. The palace itself seemed to breathe with suspicion. Footsteps echoed louder, doors closed with finality. Every corner felt as though eyes were waiting. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors to suspicion. And suspicion, in the hands of the powerful, was already half a sentence of guilt. The silence of the kingdom was shifting, darkening. What began as nothing more than a spark was slowly feeding a fire that no one dared extinguish. The palace had always been a place of silence, but now that silence felt alive, watchful, suffocating, deliberate. The daughter could no longer walk, the gardens without sensing footsteps behind her. Guards who once stood motionless now shifted, eyes fixed upon her every movement. Servants paused too long when she entered rooms, as if memorizing her gestures to carry them into the shadows of gossip. What had once been her sanctuary now felt like a stage, every corner crowded with unseen witnesses. The minister too began to feel the walls close in. Summoned more often to the king's chambers, he found questions hidden within questions, eyes searching for cracks in his composure. Once praised for his counsel, he now endured interruptions, challenges, and subtle insults from rivals who sensed weakness. The trust he had spent years building seemed to tremble with each passing day. He knew why. He did not speak it, yet the truth lingered within him like a wound. Unseen, but bleeding all the same. And then came the nobles. Those who had long envied his influence saw in the whispers a weapon. With careful tongues, they began to plant doubt, dressing gossip as loyalty, presenting suspicion as vigilance. "Your Majesty," they would say, "we see too much familiarity, too much boldness from one who should know his place." Their words dripped like venom into the king's ear, not enough to condemn, but enough to linger. The daughter felt the shift most cruelly. Once indulged, as the jewel of the court, she now found herself isolated. Invitations ceased. Doors closed softly before she arrived. Even her handmaidens seemed distant, answering her words with clipped tones, their eyes avoiding hers. It was as if the palace itself had turned against her, reminding her that she was not merely her father's child, she was a symbol, a vessel, and symbols were not permitted to falter. The minister tried to bury himself in duty, to silence suspicion with diligence. Yet each gesture of restraint only sharpened the scrutiny. If he spoke too little, they called it secrecy. If he spoke too much, they called it arrogance. Even silence betrayed him. Every step, every breath became evidence twisted against him. The king, meanwhile, began to change. His laughter grew rare, his temper quick to ignite. He prowled the corridors at night, restless, distrustful, his shadow stretching long across the marble floors. Though no one dared speak it aloud, all could sense it. The king was circling closer to the truth, or at least to the suspicion of truth. The palace was no longer a sanctuary of stone and silk. It was a net woven tighter each day, each glance another knot, each whisper another thread, and within that net, the daughter and the minister struggled, unseen yet ensnared, knowing that the slightest movement might pull the trap shut. It was only a matter of time. Whispers can be ignored, and suspicions can be dismissed, but a single incident, seen, spoken, undeniable, becomes the spark that ignites the fire. It began with a servant. Late one evening, in the stillness of the palace, he carried a tray of wine through the garden corridors. The moon hung low, silvering the stones casting shadows long and sharp, and there, at the far end of the cloister, he paused. He saw what should not have been seen. The daughter, cloaked in pale silk, standing too close to the minister. No words passed between them, no touch betrayed them, but the silence itself was damning. It was not the silence of distance, but of closeness, a stillness charged with unspoken meaning. The servant lowered his gaze, pretended not to notice, but the sight seared itself into his mind. By morning, the whispers had sharpened. What had once been suggestion now carried detail. They were seen together. She walked too close. His eyes lingered too long. The truth no longer mattered. Only the story did. The nobles seized upon it eagerly. They gathered in corners, voices low but urgent, weaving the rumor into a weapon honed to pierce the king's pride. To them, this was not about love or scandal. It was about power, blood, and the humiliation of a dynasty that claimed purity as its crown. If the daughter had indeed betrayed her bloodline with one of lesser birth, it would not merely disgrace the king, it would topple the very order upon which his rule depended. The minister felt the weight shift instantly. Guards watched, him with narrowed eyes. Courtiers withdrew from his path. The king's gaze, once commanding, now burned with suspicion, as though every breath the minister took was proof of betrayal. He had endured a lifetime of quiet prejudice, but never before had it pressed upon him with such crushing certainty. He understood then that silence could no longer protect him. For the daughter, the world had narrowed into fear. Her chambers, once filled with music and attendance, grew cold and empty. Even the gardens felt hostile, the air thick with unseen judgment. She clutched at her innocence, at the knowledge that nothing had yet been spoken aloud between them. But innocence did not matter here. Perception was enough. And in the eyes of the court, perception was truth. The king, though still silent, was already transformed. His nights grew longer, his footsteps heavier, his temper a storm waiting to break. Betrayal was the one sin he could never forgive, and whether proven or not, suspicion had already poisoned him. The palace, once a stage for grandeur, had become a hunting ground. Every corridor, every glance, every hushed breath was a trap waiting to close. The daughter and the minister were no longer simply watched, they were marked. The breaking point was here, and the walls of silence could not hold much longer. The night was heavy with silence, the kind that settles before a storm. In the great hall, torches burned low, their flames twisting in the draughts of stone corridors. The king had summoned his court without warning, and when a ruler summons at night, all know that judgment waits in the shadows. The nobles gathered, in tense clusters, their whispers slicing through the air like blades. Servants lined the walls, eyes downcast, though their ears drank in every sound. At the center, upon the throne raised above all others, the king sat like a shadow carved from iron. His face was unreadable, but his silence spoke more than words, and then they entered. The daughter, pale as moonlight, her steps trembling beneath the weight of unseen chains. Beside her, the minister walked with measured calm, his dignity unbroken, though his fate was already sealed in the eyes of the court. Together, they stood before the throne, their silence louder than any confession. The king's gaze was a fire that seared them where they stood. His pride, his bloodline, his throne. He saw them all stained by this unspoken betrayal. He did not need proof. He did not need words. In his mind, the crime had already been committed, and its stench filled the hall. One by one, voices rose from the shadows. Nobles, trembling with false reverence, repeated the whispers they had carried for weeks. They were seen together in the gardens. They lingered too long in the corridors. Their eyes betrayed what their lips would not speak. Each word was a dagger, plunged deeper into the silence. The daughter's lips parted, but no sound emerged. What defense could she offer? Innocence meant nothing here. In a kingdom built on purity, even suspicion was guilt. Her eyes burned with tears she could not shed. for to weep was to confess. The minister bowed his head, not in shame, but in the knowledge that no defense could save him. He had walked too close to fire, and now the flames would consume him. His silence, once his shield, had become his noose. The hall seemed to close in around them. The torches hissed, the stone walls pressed nearer, and the air itself grew heavy with expectation. The king rose from his throne, his voice a low growl that silenced the whispers. There, in that moment, the truth no longer mattered. Guilt had been declared, and the world would bend to the king's wrath. The unveiling was complete. The storm had broken, and what followed would be destruction. The king's voice tore through the hall, deep and unrelenting, echoing against the vaulted ceiling like thunder trapped in stone. His words were not questions but sentences, each syllable heavy with the weight of finality. There was no trial, no plea, no mercy. What stood before him was, in his eyes, the ultimate betrayal. The defilement of his bloodline by a man he had once raised from obscurity. The daughter trembled, her figure fragile beneath the gaze of the court. Yet her father did not see a child, nor his flesh and blood. He saw only dishonor carved upon her face. To him, her innocence was irrelevant. Her silence became a confession, her tears a stain that could not be washed away. The minister stood tall, though his fate was already carved in stone. His calmness infuriated the king. How dare he stand with dignity? How dare he look upon the throne with steady eyes as though he were equal? The king's fury burned not only with jealousy, but with the venom of racial hatred. Hatred that had festered for years, disguised beneath a veneer of trust. Now, unleashed, it poured forth like poison. The sentence was swift. The minister would be stripped of his titles, dragged from the palace, and put to death. His name erased, his memory condemned. The daughter, though spared his fate, was to suffer in another way. Confinement in a tower, her life reduced to silence and shadows, a living monument to shame. She would not die, but she would never live again. The hall erupted in murmurs, but none dared challenge the decree. Nobles bowed their heads, some in fear, others in satisfaction. The servants wept quietly, knowing that injustice had triumphed once more, yet powerless to resist. Guards seized the minister, chains clattered against stone, a sound as cold and merciless as the decree itself. Yet even as they bound his wrists, he did not cry out. His silence became his final act of defiance, a refusal to give the king the satisfaction of his despair. The daughter's cry broke at last, a sound of anguish that cut through the hall like a blade. But the king did not falter. To him, her pain was necessary, her suffering the price of restoring honor. He turned away, his throne towering once more, above the wreckage of 2 lives. The judgment was complete. The palace stood hushed, its walls echoing with the memory of chains, cries, and silence. Yet beneath the silence lingered something greater than fear, the knowledge that no punishment could erase what had been seen, what had been felt, what had been lost. The king believed he had restored order. In truth, he had destroyed it. His wrath had silenced voices, but in that silence, the seeds of rebellion and sorrow had already taken root. The palace was never the same again. The night of judgment became a shadow that stretched over every corridor, every banquet, every whispered conversation. Where laughter once echoed, silence lingered. Where trust once bound king and court, suspicion poisoned every glance. The daughter's chambers, high in the cold tower, became a prison of memory. Days passed into months, yet she never set foot beyond its stone walls. The windows that overlooked the kingdom below only mocked her, showing her a world she could never touch. She became a ghost within her own father's palace, a reminder of shame he wished forgotten, but could never erase. The minister's death was swifter than his life deserved, but his absence was louder than his presence had ever been. The palace machinery faltered without him, decisions slowed, diplomacy fractured, and the king, though too proud to admit it, had cut out the very heart of his governance. The man once despised for his blood had been the silent spine of the kingdom, and now that spine was broken. Word of the judgment spread far beyond the palace gates. In the villages and fields, whispers grew into outrage. The people had loved the minister, not for his birth, but for his fairness, his wisdom, his ability to see beyond the lines that divided them. His death was not justice in their eyes, but murder dressed in royal cloth. Discontent stirred. Farmers muttered in markets, soldiers grumbled in barracks, and merchants carried stories across borders. To neighboring kingdoms, the king appeared, not as strong, but unstable. A ruler blinded by rage, willing to destroy his own house to protect his pride. The weight of this discontent grew heavy. Taxes went unpaid, small rebellions sparked like kindling in the dark, and the king's grip, once unshakable, began to tremble. The punishment he had thought would restore his honor had instead unraveled the very foundation of his power. Years later, when the king's throne sat empty and his line fractured by greed and bloodshed, the story of his daughter and the minister lived on. Not in official records, those were scrubbed clean of the scandal, but in whispers, songs, and the quiet memory of the people. To them, it was never the tale of a princess's betrayal. It was the story of a man condemned for his blood, of a love, or even the possibility of love, crushed beneath the weight of prejudice. It was a reminder that injustice, though it may silence voices in the moment, speaks louder across generations. And the king? His name faded into the long list of rulers whose pride devoured their legacy. But the minister's silence became legend. His refusal to bow, his quiet dignity in the face of cruelty, made him immortal in ways the king could never be. Even the daughter, long forgotten within her tower, became a symbol of innocence destroyed by power, a warning of what happens when rulers value bloodlines over humanity.